Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening today. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about what to keep in mind when you're preparing for your first product launch, especially at a pre-launch company. This is your first NDC, and there are a number of initiatives to get a commercial organization up and running. So we're going to talk about some of our recent experiences and what we feel is important with respect to market access and government pricing in particular. First, as usual, a little bit about Akara. We are a consulting and technology organization with a bunch of years of experience in this space of market access and government pricing. And in addition to our consulting, which largely revolves around forecasting and gross to net government pricing and contract operations, we also offer a forecasting and contract analytics platform called Simply. Today, as I mentioned a minute ago, what we're going to cover is not all aspects of pre-launch commercialization activities, but zero in on a few key things that are important, namely a little bit about organization planning with respect to market access, pre-launch forecasting and gross to net, and government programs participation and some things to keep in mind. Okay, I guess first and foremost, what should we consider for setup of market access operations for the first launch? Ramping up a commercial organization has a bunch of challenges. You're moving from being a clinical stage company to one that's worried about all things market access, from contract development, patient access, government pricing, analytics, etc. And moreover, those decisions on how to structure an operational model are made in an uncertain planning environment. You're awaiting readout data for clinical trials. You may or may not have a PDUFA date yet. So, sometimes we're talking anywhere from 1 year to even 2.5 years away from a potential launch, where you're starting to think about how do I set up the organization and how do I sequence the activities I'm going to work on, so I'm going about this in the most efficient way possible. And market access operations are particularly challenged because of responsibility for a vast value chain, from trade and distribution, through working with payers and insurers, through working with providers and prescribers to ultimately get the product to the patient. And of course, there are patient support services, copay programs, and the all-important aspect of patient affordability that's being assessed during this pre-launch phase. And beyond all that, you're going to be ramping up a team that may have very seasoned, experienced, smart professionals coming from various backgrounds. But one person may have worked on a pharmacy benefit product and now are working in a medical benefit environment. Another person may have worked at Big Pharma for many years. So, where you may have involved in a niche area, now you're rolling up your sleeves to address various functions. So these things, kind of require a change in mindset in how you're going about the business day to day. So a lot to think about. In terms of the organization, if you're looking at this picture, in the center you have the launch company and the market access and finance group. And I say group, but really we could be talking about, especially if you're a couple of years away from launch, maybe 1, 2, 3 people. You might have a head of market access, you might have a financial controller, and then you might have one other analytics professional or a data management professional. And that team has to string together the plan, right? You don't have a field force yet because you're not there yet, but you have to think about account management. You don't have a government pricing team yet, but you have to think about government pricing. So how do you do all of these things? And you're being circled by, I need a trade and distribution strategy. I need to set up contract operations, and I need to set up patient support services. Pre-launch, there's a few things that seem to take precedence right away, right? You're a couple of years away. We're not really at an operational state yet, but we are doing customer landscaping and payer strategy. What is my customer mix going to be? What is my target market? Is there third-party data available to me so I can identify the target market? And if I'm going to be contracting with payers or working on access with payers, how do I segment what that's going to be? If it's a Part D product, how do I determine what my mix of LIS and non-LIS lives are, and what does that mean for my coverage gap liability? Ultimately, all of these things enter into determining coverage and access and reimbursement and how my product will be covered. So ultimately, I can determine, based on the coverage available to my patients, the different benefit designs that my payers that I can expect, the customers that I'm targeting, what will my patient lives target be, right? I might have a total addressable market of 20 million patient lives, but once I consider insurance coverage, disease state, competitive products, that lives market whittles down. Getting to that target lives is really the key input to getting into what Akara does, which is working on forecasting gross to net and government pricing. In a pre-launch environment, what we do and what we work with companies to do is say, okay, we have a lives target, now we can start building a forecast. We can estimate X factory in demand. We can estimate, we can make assumptions on contracting and government pricing to really determine that initial gross to net forecast. And then in addition to that, we can talk about government programs, policy, and enrollment. What do you have to think about to comply with Medicaid, VA, FSS, Medicare, et cetera? And the all-important question of how do I keep fair market value in mind for the various agreements I'm going to be entering into. So to summarize pre-launch, let's say you're 2 years out, more often than not, you're working with your partners on that sort of customer landscape and payer strategy, determining how you're going to establish coverage and reimbursement for the product, and your patient support service strategy, so to speak. And this should go hand in hand with developing that initial demand forecast and that gross to net forecast, because the two feed off of each other. The patient lives feed the forecast feeds back to, okay, if I'm going to expect this amount of net, maybe I'm establishing a copay budget. How does that feed back to my pre-launch strategy? Post-launch, you're getting maybe a year out, you start focusing on sort of my account management, how I'm setting up contract operations, am I working with a 3PL for chargeback processing, how are patient support services tactically going to work with a hub, with organizing the various data from benefits verification to adherence information, et cetera, that you will get as part of patient support services, and really putting a government compliance program in place. And at some point you think about how do I transition from a pre-launch forecasting approach to post-launch. Again, you're keeping a lean team initially, most likely, and you're working with various likely vendors that have expertise in these different areas that are surrounding you and supporting you. What we're often seeing right now is that in that lean team internally, a head of market access will look for almost what we like to call a contracts and pricing unicorn. It's that individual that understands government pricing, contract operations, rebate adjudication, forecasting, and then oversees the entire process with the vendors that you're working with. The problem is that resource is pretty rare and hard to find. So it's of utmost importance that the service providers you work with not only deliver for you individually, but work with each other so nothing falls through the cracks. Because often you're going to have a little bit of a gap in a shepherd internally who can manage everything, right? It takes time to find that right person. So that fragmented team is somewhat unavoidable, but it can be a good thing if managed correctly because you bring different perspectives to the table. So perhaps first and foremost, have everyone talk to each other and over-communicate. There could be overlaps. There could be knowledge that one group can share with another that can help their activity they're working on, and ultimately leads to more efficient process as you move the ball forward towards launch. Okay, moving into some specifics. As I mentioned, we are working extensively with pre-launch companies right now, and where we tend to focus most of our time is on forecasting gross to net modeling and government pricing, preparing for government pricing and government programs enrollment. So let's talk a little bit about pre-launch forecasting first. Overall, we believe an effective forecast and gross to net model allows you to efficiently maneuver list price contracting and patient lives assumptions. That way you can model sales adjustments like returns, for example, and liabilities such as rebates and fees. Also, especially for example in a Part B environment, modeling the reimbursement impact to providers, especially for those buy and bill products. So for example, will a physician be underwater with ASP plus 4.3% if you're offering other contracted discounts to Kaiser, for example? How do they affect each other? And when the Defense Department sequestration ends in 2022 and ASP kicks back up, how do we monitor those changes as we're developing a 4 or 5 year forecast from launch? We stand in 2019 now. A lot of our clients that are launching in today's time frame to 2020, 2021 are looking at the 2025, 2026 in their forecasts. Key drivers of the pre-launch forecast are patient targets and payer channel mix. These assumptions typically drive development of a demand unit forecast, and then what we do is prices, contracting, and payer benefit design assumptions can dollarize the forecast and establish gross to net projections. For example, WAC price action assumptions, payer, provider, and trade contracting, for example, access rebates, price protection, bona fide and non-bona fide fees, commercial and government chargebacks, etc. Assumptions around all of these discount types given to 340B, VA, Kaiser, GPO, and then of course on the payer, commercial and Part D side. Moreover, coverage gap liability for your non-LIS lives. How do you model the impact of coverage gap as the catastrophic care threshold changes, as every year the out-of-pocket assumptions change? How do we make an estimate of what our manufacturer side liability will be? And then, to me, most recently, maybe most important, copay buy-down budgets for patient affordability targets. As in a pre-launch organization, you're setting strategic objectives initially, which often revolve around two large things. One is market penetration, right? Establishing your product in the market. And two, making sure the patient can afford and have access to that product. They might have access from an insurance perspective, but if they can't afford it, then it may not mean a whole lot much as you launch and want to successfully penetrate. So how do you take the various benefit design assumptions across different payer and plan types, high deductible employer plans, individual health exchange plans, etc., and say, okay, based on the various deductibles, co-insurance or copay factors, what is my estimated out-of-pocket cost to the patient? And then what do I want to buy down the copay? What can I afford to? And what am I willing to in order to support the patient in really having access to our product? So we find that's a key lever in building these models and being able to maneuver that lever. And then as I mentioned earlier, sales adjustments like returns and other deductions such as product wastage, the branded pharmaceutical fee, all contribute to a robust pre-launch gross to net model. And then finally, to keep in mind government pricing, contracting assumptions can drive precision on government pricing projections. So by taking all the contracting assumptions, WAC price action assumptions, we can bottoms up estimate Medicaid rebate liability, VA pricing, 340B pricing, and ASP in order to, as sort of precisely as possible, gauge what the impact of government will be. So let's transition from forecasting and think about government programs for a moment. Across the various programs, there's a bunch of stuff to consider to get enrolled across the MDRP, FSSVA, 340B, Part D, Part B. I guess first and foremost, as many of us know, if you participate in MDRP, you are participating in the 340B program, right? So they go part and parcel in one with the other. As is if you participate in Part B Medicare, you're participating in 340B as well. So when you're making a decision on government programs participation, it's important to understand the dependencies across these programs. The second aspect, aside from the dependencies of participation, is timing. When do I need to take action in order to participate? The one that has been ringing out, as silly as it may seem and as simple as it may seem, is Part D. Establishing a P number with CMS, if you want to participate in January 2021, has to be done in 2019, so 2 years in advance. If you don't get that P number, you're in a situation where you have to piggyback off of another manufacturer's P number, which may be fine, but in some cases it can also be an additional complication. So if you have a Part D drug, if you're 2 years out and you know you'll be participating in Part D, then it makes sense, all the sense in the world, to establish that P number. It's a quick process with CMS to do so. With the VA, there's actually a little bit more time. You'll establish an interim agreement with the VA, and then at launch you have provisional pricing. So executing that formal 5-year contract with the FSS actually pushes into post-launch. So if you're prioritizing government programs management, you almost start with that P number first. In the 1 year before launch, you get it established on the Medicaid drug rebate program in 340B. You set up an interim agreement with the VA. And then from there, you have a post-launch strategy to have a formal agreement with the FSS, and you move on from there. Now, of course, there's other factors, for example, with Medicaid, such as the Medicaid states establishing their coverage policy for drugs. So, that typically can take 6 to 8 months, and you often will see a delay in invoices from Medicaid, but it doesn't mean you don't want to have the participation set up 1 to 2 quarters before launch so you're ready to go right away. And of course, there's plenty more to discuss in terms of tactics on those programs, but those are some highlights that we wanted to call out. So as I mentioned, be aware of key timelines for government programs. When you're preparing for government pricing, 2 years out from launch, you don't necessarily need to get those policies and reasonable assumptions in place. I would say in that year before launch, you start putting those things together. Most important are policies and reasonable assumptions that you can consistently apply. If you're a drug that is a oral oncology drug that goes through the specialty channels, chances are your AMP may actually be a pretty simple calculation given the rules and regulations from CMS. So the sophistication of the software or spreadsheets you'll use to do those calculations is not as important as just having documented those policies and reasonable assumptions so you can say, here's clearly what we're doing. And as you staff up to address those things, you have those in place. So as you're working with your consultants, your providers, or internally, really focus on what's important, which is, let's just have our framework in place, and then we can scale up the technology to support it as need be. If we're going to have a lot of contracting at launch, maybe we need something that's more sophisticated technology-wise. If we're going to have minimal contracting and AMP is going to be equal to WAC less a prompt pay discount essentially at launch, then maybe we can do something simpler and we can scale up post-launch as the product establishes itself in the market. That could be an efficient and more cost-effective approach. When you're setting provisional government pricing, consider the impact of restatement. So for example, provisional 340B price. After the first couple of quarters, the HRSA requires a look back to say, okay, you set a provisional price, what would that price actually have been now that you have actual data to calculate? And given that, do a restatement to true up the entities. So that can be labor-intensive work. So you want to keep in mind how you're setting that price pre-launch and gauge that against how much pre-work for restatements you're willing to take on later on. And then finally, fair market value, everyone's favorite topic. It's important to set up an evaluation policy. Often you can set one up based on the CMS bona fide service fee test criteria, and you can apply that across AMP, best price, and ASP. And although the VA has its own rules, most importantly is a FMV policy for government pricing treatment that's consistently applied. So you might set up and use the CMS bona fide service fee test for AMP, BP, and ASP, and based off of the VA somewhat open-ended rules for the non-FAMP side, we even see some clients use the CMS rules across the board. So it's really just documenting and consistently applying it and making sure your legal counsel is comfortable with what you've set up. But the other point to make on fair market value is there's no need to be over-engineering here. You want to set up a process where you perform the qualitative compliance elements of the 4-part test and then the quantitative elements of the fair market value portion in an order that lets you efficiently evaluate this, right? If you fail one of the qualitative components, then there's no need to do the quantitative component of fair market value. But you want to make sure you address them for the contracts that you're establishing, so you're covered. A summary of some takeaways. Keep operations as simple as possible. Build an efficient organization across people, process, data, and tech, and then allow room to scale up post-launch, right? You can always scale up later. It's hard to scale down in the event, for example, the product doesn't take off or some other unfortunate set of circumstances. Avoid unforced errors and analysis paralysis. So there's no reason to miss that P number filing deadline. You can do that right away if you know you're going to be in Part D. A good way to do this is just 2 years in advance of launch, a simple one-page Excel spreadsheet to document what's required for government communications, government enrollment. For example, you may need to notify HRSA of a managed distribution network. We document a list of these activities, and then you can frame out when you're going to perform these. Establish a sales and liabilities forecast model early on so it can drive precision when setting strategic objectives such as supporting patient affordability with copay programs. So you can start with a simple model and you can always kind of refine it, true it up, add contracting assumptions as you get closer to launch, and have a better sense of how you're going to market with your customers and payers. But I would caution, avoid over-engineering those launch forecast scenarios. For example, and I could not be more sincere in this, there's no need to model every single government proposal. It's okay to wait for some clarity because false precision can result from over-modeling. For example, the safe harbor rebate rule. We modeled this, and then actually just yesterday, I'm recording this on a Friday, it was removed, it was withdrawn by the administration. So while modeling it teaches us a lot, we have to prioritize also day-to-day practical activities as well. Prioritize data management. From the start, organize a central place to keep your third party and eventually your own sales and rebates data so you can leverage it for analytics. And the solution you use to house that data can scale over time. And finally, as we mentioned, communicate. Everything is easier if internally, with your vendors, with your stakeholders, you're over communicating on information so you can problem solve more effectively. And that's it. We wanted to give them some quick thoughts on what we've been doing with pre-launch companies. Of course, there's always a lot more to talk about, so absolutely contact us. You can contact us at info@acaragroup.com or me directly at romit@acaragroup.com, and you can find us on the web. Thanks for your time today.